Thank you, Mary. And my name is Steve McCrockman. I'm the Executive Director at Langsford Learning Acceleration Centers. We're super glad you all are here. This is the kickoff to our 16th season for the Langsford Lecture Series. So we're really glad that each of you are here. So Myra, I see you're there online. We'll go ahead and tip this over to you.
So today, I've been asked to talk a little bit about what you need to know when we're requesting accommodations on the ACT. And it's kind of divided up into parts, and some of this you may already know, and some of it you may not. So I just wanted to start with some basics that what are accessibility and accommodations on the ACT? Well, anything. And so basically accommodations are your basic authorized adaptations to the standardized testing procedures intended to reduce and or eliminate the effects of an examinee's disability, but they should not reduce your scope of learning or the expectations or complexity or rigor of a test. Our policy for requesting accommodations is available on the website. The website's linked here, and after this meeting, I will send a PDF of the presentation so you guys can have it, and the link should be live in the PDF. Our official policy is that we provide access to the ACT test for individuals with disabilities through appropriate and allowable accommodations based on the examinee's demonstrated need. To assist examinees in demonstrating the need, ACT has established guidelines regarding submission of documentation of an examinee's disability and a history of using the accommodations. So I put those bold words in there so you kind of have an idea of what it is we're looking for. And then our policy continues that we approve in accordance with the ADA and alignment with determinations made by school officials pursuant to IDEA and Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. So what does the ADA consider a disability? And so this is the standard that we use. They're a qualified person with a current impairment, with a record of impairment, or who are regarded as having an impairment. And that impairment needs to be a significant impairment to a major life activity when compared to the average person in the general population. Most of the time when we're talking about the ACT, that major life activity is learning. So how is their diagnosis impacting their learning and other areas? So if it's impacting other areas, we really want you to tell us, hey, they're also having issues with social, or they're having issues in, with work or things like that. The more we understand that there is an impairment in more than just test taking, the better able we are to understand this student and their needs. If I like to think of it as you're kind of telling us their story through the documentation you give us. And the better we understand what's going on, the more we're able to say, yes, the student really does have a disability under the ADA. Yes, they really do need these accommodations. So when it comes to standardized testing, testing is really legally vague onto whether or not that is considered a major life activity. So that's when I talked about, really wanting to know more than just test taking. It's because it's legally vague. So we're really looking for additional life activities. So if it's learning, they really struggle in class. And so tell us more about the educational environment rather than just saying they need more time for tests. Okay, why? What else are we seeing beyond just taking a standardized test? I talked a little bit about that educational team. So the educational team are the people that are really familiar with their student. They identify what accessibility supports the student really needs to access the same curriculum and instruction as their peers without disabilities. So we're looking at what are you implementing at school for this student so that they can really access what they need at school to not only learn the content, but then demonstrate that learning. Generally speaking, educational teams should include educators, school staff, parents and guardians, students, and it may include more. Those are just kind of a general basis of an educational team. And then we also talking about the accommodations plan. If you remember back in the policy, we talked about that history of use. So how do you as the educators know that these accommodations are effective for the student? And generally, again, you're getting a lot of generalies. We're looking at an accommodations plan that you've put in place so that the teachers and others that are interacting with your students know what it is that you guys say this student really needs, whether it's they need extra time on tests or they need extra time on assignments, or what is it that this student needs to access the curriculum. They need written notes. They need somebody to read to them because they have a reading disability and they can't comprehend written word alone. And you don't have to go into specific details, but really telling us what accommodations they need. And then another note here, we say that they really should be used in the academic environment and should not be introduced just prior to the testing. And part of that is most accommodations students need to understand how to use. My favorite example of that is extra time. Well, if you give them extra time and they don't understand how they need to pace themselves and how to use that extra time, then that extra time may or may not be sufficient because they go, oh, I have extra time, and go really slow, or they realize they have extra time, but they still speed through. So that's why we're talking about it really should be implemented at school, and maybe not directly taught, but they need to understand how to use the accommodation to support their learning differences. And then the other thing about the accommodations plan, we really prefer that if things are specifically listed. So sometimes on an accommodations plan, we'll see, well, they need extra time. We really kind of need to know how much extra time. So the better choice would be they need 50% extra time. So trying to be a little more specific, well, they need to test in the resource room. Well, what does that mean? You know, is that individual testing? Is that small group testing? Again, trying to give us an understanding of what these things might look like in your school. We see a lot of schools and they use similar wording, and it's difficult for us to interpret what that wording on the educational plan means. So the more specific you can get, but it doesn't have to be overly detailed. And that may sound kind of vague, but it's really, again, you're trying to tell us what the student's day might look like, what accommodations, you know, we have found are successful for the school, or not for the school, for the student, because all accommodations truly are individualized to that student and what they need. So that's kind of the overview of our policy. And when I say kind of, that is the overview of our policy. Sorry about that. So next I want to talk about what are the allowable accommodations and English learner supports. Again, we have this actually up on the website that can go into it more. Again, I have the link there. Let me see if I can, whoops. Nope, that didn't pull it up. Again, it's a PDF that's available. We put it out there, I want to say last year, possibly the year before. And when you look at it, it's divided up into national accommodations versus special accommodations, because that's a question we get a lot, is what's available at a national testing center versus what's available through the special testing program. But we put it out there really to help, you know, students and families and staff plan for what are things that the student might need and what does ACT consider allowable accommodations. As we look at accommodations, one of the things we can look at are the presentation accommodations. So I split the list we have out into basically 4 categories. It's really, yeah, basically 4 categories. So when we're talking about presentation accommodations, this is how the student receives the test. For national testing, our testing is all paper-based except for screen reader software, which is on the computer because that's how screen reader software works. ACT is working towards having an online or computer-based version of the test available at national testing centers. It's not there yet. We're working on it. And we are hopeful that it will be available next testing cycle, but we're working out some logistics around things about who supplies computers, things like that. Do we need to have computer-based centers? There's a lot of questions ACT is going through to see how we can operationalize this concept of online testing for on national test days. So some of our presentation accommodations are audio amplification. Can we make the test louder, or does the student somehow need it louder? That might include like FM systems and things like that that we're talking about that I'll talk about in the setting area. Presentation accommodations, Braille. So for our students who have visual impairments that read Braille, generally speaking, that would be a blind student. We do offer the contracted Braille in all 3 Braille codes that are currently used in the United States. We allow for color contrast and color overlays to be used where they might bring in that acetate paper, which changes the background color between the font and the paper. We have a human reader available. A note about human readers, that is a one-to-one administration. And it is also always assigned to triple time because that is how long it takes to present the test. We have a lot of people that will ask for a human reader and only time and a half, and then they go, well, they don't need triple time. If you're reading the test to the students, that's how long it takes. We have large print available, and that comes in 18-point font. We do not produce it in larger than 18-point font. So if you're asking for a larger font for your student, we will need to figure out a combination of accommodations to help that student. One thing that might help them is a magnifier. So they can have a full sheet magnifier, a handheld magnifier, but something just to enlarge the test. It might even be a CCTV, for those of you familiar with that. The issue with a CCTV, to be honest, is that they can read it, but they can't mark their answers with the CCTV, so there's some concerns there. The other thing that we've actually had people ask for is like a digital projector as a magnifier so that they can put it up on a wall so it gets really large. That again would be an individual administration, and the digital projector can't take pictures of it. It needs to just put it up on the wall. Another accommodation that's available is the pre-recorded audio. The difference between pre-recorded audio and the human reader is that with pre-recorded audio, you could test them in a group. Basically, they need to have a computer type device that has a USB drive, because you'll get a USB, you plug in the USB, they put on headphones, and then they can control the speed and such. The pre-recorded audio is based on the reader script, but as I said, the advantage to that is that since they have headphones and control it themselves, you're able to test students in a small group setting with that, rather than the individual administration of a human reader. So that makes a difference when you're thinking about how am I going to test the students? How much staff am I going to need? Pre-recorded audio could be a better option than the human reader. Students can also have a printed copy of the verbal instructions. So if you have a student who may not be able to follow the verbal instructions, it might be a hearing impairment, it might be something else, we can have an accommodation where they can get the printed copy to follow along. We now offer screen reader software. This is fairly new to the ACT. I think we implemented it 2 years ago. It became available, but this past test cycle, so this past test year, we really had students beginning to use it more, and we're seeing more and more requests for it. Screen reader software is different than text-to-speech, and so I want to bring that out. Screen reader software is really developed for students who are blind or have visual impairments. This is something they need to be using on a regular basis. And I actually have the next slide talks a little bit more about that. Presentation, again, we have sign language interpreter for the verbal instructions, which we basically allow in almost any sign language system, English-based sign language system, such as ASL, CASE, which is, and cued speech. So those verbal instructions are available to students who are deaf. But we also have a sign language interpreter for the entire test. We do limit that to SEE and cued speech. ASL and CASE are more interpretive sign language systems, whereas SEE and cued speech are direct translations of the English using English grammar. So that's the difference between those. So for the entire test, when you're doing items and response choices, SEE and cued speech is available. We also have a standalone tactile graphics. Generally, those are with Braille. They will also use them with screen reader software, and they may come with large print. So if you have a student that needs to feel the graphics, that's what our tactile graphics are. So screen reader software, as I said, it's fairly new. Screen reader software is for people with visual impairments. It provides access to a speech synthesizer or the refreshable Braille displays. It provides alternative text for the graphics. And this is the important, or what I consider the most important part. It provides navigation cues. So that's why I'm like going, it is not text to speech. It is navigation. It reads basically everything on the screen. Currently, ACT is able to provide this using JAWS or NVDA, which are the two most popular screen reader softwares. We are working on trying to do compatibility with different software systems, but for the best examining experience, JAWS and NVDA are the two that work. Those were our presentation. Now, I can talk a little bit about response accommodations, or how students let us know what they need. Again, we have an accessible calculator or abacus. Calculators are only allowed on the math assessment, but we can do that. Answer masking, so they can cover up answer choices and open them up one at a time. This would be note cards or something that they bring into the room. An answer eliminator, they can cross off answers in the test booklet if they need to. It needs in the test booklet is a little more freedom on what they write, because the test booklet is not scanned. We use the answer documents where they're filling in the bubbles. They can use different assistive devices, and I know that sounds kind of vague, but what is it that they need to help? It might be, I'm trying to think, it might be, I don't know, sorry, but we call it assistive devices. It's kind of vague on our wording of it. I will give you a reference to our accessibility and accommodations guide, or accessibility supports guide at the end, and it has a very clear definition of what we consider assistive devices. For students who are blind, they can use their Brailler or Braille note taker. You can ask for a computer for the writing section. So if you have students that really need to type their answers rather than handwrite them, you can ask for that. They can respond in an alternate method. So you have a student that needs to point or needs to do eye gaze, again, an accommodation that's available for them. They can use a highlighter as an accommodation if they need that to help with their tracking or things like that. One of our response accommodations that we're seeing more and more requests for is marking answers in the test booklet. This has actually been around for a while, but I think more people are becoming familiar with it. So you have students that have difficulty with the Scantron, maybe they have difficulty filling in the bubbles correctly, maybe they jump lines. You can have it so that they have permission to mark the answers in the test booklet, and then an adult would transcribe those over to the Scantron for the student. Students are able to mark answers for review, which means that they can basically go back in the test booklet and go back and say, oh, I'm not 100% sure on this, so let me go back and review that test item. They can ask for a scribe to just directly mark as they're going. They can use speech to text software. Again, that would be on a computer to answer. And typically we see that for the writing portion of the test, where, again, for whatever reason, typing isn't sufficient and they need to use speech to text where they talk to the computer and it writes for them. That one definitely needs to be used on a regular basis, because speech to text software, while it's becoming more and more intuitive, is not necessarily something you can just pick up on test day. You don't need to be learning a software program while you're trying to take the ACT. Spell checkers are available, that you can ask for those. And then also the ability to work on scratch paper. All students are allowed to work, write on the back of their admission tickets or things like that. But if they need additional scratch paper, you can ask for that as an accommodation so they can bring it into the testing environment with them. Timing accommodations, these are the most often requested. The most often requested one is actually time and a half. Other ones that are available to them are the breaks as needed, and breaks as needed used to be called stop the clock breaks, and those are available with standard time testing. So if you have a student with a medical issue that needs to be taken care of immediately, I think of diabetes, I think of POTS, things like that, that's when you would do this breaks as needed so they can stop, take care of their medical issues, and then come back to testing. As I said, the one that's most popular, most often asked for is time and a half in a single session. The official name in our TAA system is 1 1/2 time. We know what you're asking for. If it's written on the student's plan as time and a half or 50% time, we get that. We can make those assumptions. Another one that we're seeing more often is 1 1/2 time over multiple days. When ACT is looking at it, we're going, why do they need multiple days? And what does that look like in your school? Double time over multiple days is available. We also have an accommodation that's just double time for just the writing. So they don't need it in reading or science or English or math. They just need it for the writing section. So you can ask for double time just for the writing only. And we also have triple time, which is over multiple days. Typically, triple time is associated with one of those audio presentation formats, such as the pre-recorded audio or the human reader. You can also have a personalized notification of time remaining. So even though the standardized process is to write it on the board or let them know when there's a 5-minute warning, there is a way that you can ask the student needs something different, whether it's tap them on the shoulder, give them a note card that says 5 minutes less, something like that can be authorized as an accommodation. And the other one that a lot of people aren't familiar with is the time of day of testing. At a national testing center, everybody starts at the same time, but you may have a student that's on a medication that they're really groggy at first thing in the morning or something like that. So at your school, you're going, oh, we just don't test them first thing in the morning because we know they're not going to be able to show us what they know. So you can request a time of day change, that we need to have it, they need to test later in the day, so that they will be able to demonstrate. And as I said, typically time of day has to do with a medication that they're taking or some reason. It's not a preference. Well, they prefer to test in the afternoon. Oh, we need to have a reason why they need to test in the afternoon or later in the day. That setting accommodations, so changes to the testing environment, audio amplification or an FM system. So that goes back to, again, you have a student who needs to have it presented to them louder. Background music can be asked for. You can ask to have a countdown timer, which shows them how much time they have left, and that can help with their pacing. They can have fidget devices. So our students that typically have those things in the classroom to help relieve their anxiety, those are available as an accommodation. You can ask for food, drink, and medication. Again, that's typically due to a medical thing. Most students can have water in the testing environment, but if they need food or medication, and then the drink, you can ask for those. An individual administration can be asked for, and then medical monitoring devices. This is a newer accommodation. More and more students have insulin pumps or continuous glucose monitors and things like that. So the general rule with medical devices is if it's attached to the student, you don't have to ask for it. We do need it to not have any alarm sound or other things going off that's going to disrupt the other students. But if it's attached to the student, that's fine. Where the medical monitoring devices are different is most often those are like a cell phone. I personally have a continuous glucose monitor, and my cell phone has to be within 20 feet of me to record what's going on. But a cell phone is a prohibited device in the testing environment. So you can ask for it and say, they have a continuous, you can ask for that medical monitoring device, and we can allow it in the testing environment. Your general rule is going to be that it is with the room proctor, and the student can't access it whenever. But again, we probably have that combined with stop the clock breaks, so the student can go, oh, I need to check it. They can come up and check it with the supervisor there. And it's not that the supervisor is going, what are you doing? It's making sure that they're not going onto the internet or something else, that they're using it just to monitor their medical device. But that is available to students. Noise buffers, earplugs, preferential seating. They need to be seated close to a window. They need to be not underneath an air conditioning vent. So preferential seating is available. Small group testing, which is a group smaller than 20. Standing, walking, pacing. You have a student, when I was teaching, I had a student that just needed to stand in the back of the classroom during instruction. He was able to understand the concepts better, and sometimes he'd walk back and forth a little bit. So that is available on the ACT test. Generally, we're going to be giving that as an individual instruction or individual testing environment. If they need to test in a different locations, such as they're homebound or they're in a care facility, you can request that and we can approve that. And if they need to have, we call it a visual environment, we need the lighting adjusted. They have migraines, and so they need to have dimmer lights, or they need to have brighter lights. That lighting or something else in the room needs to be adjusted to help their vision. So I already talked about medical monitoring devices, but just to reiterate, if it's physically attached to them, like a cochlear implant, a heart monitor, an insulin pump, you don't have to request those as long as the alarms are turned off so they're not disruptive to other test takers. But if they do need a cell phone or something else to monitor, those need to be requested. And I want to touch on English learner supports. They're available. Technically, they're not accommodations, although some people group them into the same category. So if you have students at your school who are identified as limited English proficiency, they can use a bilingual dictionary, translated test directions, small group setting, or one-on-one half time. English learner supports, those are the 4 you could ask for. And our documentation around English learner supports is we need to know that at your school, they're identified as not English proficient, or they have limited English proficiency. The translated directions here on this slide, they are available in these languages. And there is an ACT approved bilingual word-to-word dictionary list available. And so I said 4, those were the big 4. So let's talk a little bit about what we call other requests, which might be something that's very unique to that student. Because of test validity, making sure that we're not impacting what the test is designed to measure, not all instructional accommodations are going to be allowable. We need to make sure that it's allowable. we may have to do some research on it, contacting our research team, contacting our content development team, just to make sure that it does not alter that test construct. But you can pretty much ask for anything that's on the student's plan. We just have to check and make sure it's not going to invalidate the test. We wouldn't want to have the student test and then say, oh, that wasn't valid, it changed what the test measured. So just for awareness, we're going to check that. And the example I provide here is we actually often get requests for this is people say, well, they need to use a calculator on the science test. That has already been predetermined by ACT. It's not allowed because it invalidates what that test is designed to measure. So it's just not allowed. I'm going to go over documentation fairly quickly. I'm just going to hit it again. Our documentation's out there on the website. We have it broken down by disability category. I'm going to go through the next few slides. I have highlighted some of the important things on them, so we can do this fairly quickly. If they have a learning disability, so reading, writing, math, whatever the learning disability is, we are looking for test results within the past 3 years. That's based on, part of it is that IEPs, which we see more often in public schools, have to be re-reviewed and the student has to be re-evaluated every 3 years. So our policy around that is there. We need to basically make sure that it's still being impactful for the student. We are looking for ADHD. We are looking for an evaluation, again, within the past 3 years. One of the things that we have difficulty seeing in ADHD evaluations is this onset before the age of 12. ADHD is considered a developmental disability, so that's where that age 12 comes in. And then again, what is the current impact? If they have not needed extra time until they take the ACT, we're going, is that impact enough to call it a disability? So again, we're looking at that longer, that history of use and that current impairment. So how is it impacting the student now? So anytime you see current impairment, we're going, how is it impacting them now? Our psychiatric disorders, so that might be your depression or anxiety. Those are, we need that documentation from within the past year because they change so often. So we need to, again, we're looking at how is it currently impacting the student. Visual impairments, again, we're looking for within the past year so that we know, yes, it's that they're having continual vision issues. And then we're also, if the vision is impacting their reading, we need the measuring of that. This might sound kind of like a funny story, but I got to talk to a parent one time of a student with a visual impairment, and their visual impairment is they had lost vision in one eye. And the parent told me, well, of course they need accommodations because they only have one eye to use. And so they read half as fast as everybody else. And my response was, well, then we should be able to see that on a reading test, and please provide us a reading test. Students with a hearing impairment, we're looking at something within the past 3 years. And so we're looking at the date of the hearing loss. And again, this is something that generally students with a hearing loss will have gone in to have it checked within the past 3 years. So we're not necessarily asking for something new. We're asking for what's the most recent time that they have seen their specialist, and that we're seeing that impact. Again, hearing impairment may decrease over time. So when was the last time they were checked, and is it continuing to be a problem? And so that's why you get the 3 years there. Generally, most people have done it within 3 years. Autism spectrum disorders, so that could be autism, it could be Asperger's, it could be the PDD. So again, we're looking at within the past 3 years. One of the other things that we're really looking for with autism spectrum disorders is what type of special education or interventions have been successful at school. And then again, current information regarding how it's impacting them in that learning environment. Speech language disorders, again, within the past 3 years, and what's the current impact on their reading, written expression, and learning. Other medical conditions, we say we need to hear from the treating professional within the past year. That could be their family physician or whoever, and we just need something that says they were diagnosed on this date, this is the medications, or this is the current treatment that we're doing for the student. We are looking for the age of onset and what medical treatment that's going on. And it's not that, oh, if they were just recently diagnosed that there's a problem. Again, we're just trying to understand why it's impactful, and maybe it's impactful now, but it hasn't been in the past. So it just helps us understand what's going on more. Traumatic brain injuries is another one that varies. So we're looking for the date of the accident on that. What therapy or what treatment did they have? How long were they out of school? And is there continual educational impairment? If they're not continuing to have problems just because they had a traumatic brain injury, does not necessarily mean they need accommodations or that they have a disability. So more information on our accommodations for the ACT can be found on our accessibility and supports guide for national and special testing. It was revised this year. The first version of it came out last year, and this is what I call our one-stop shop. I'm going to see if I can adjust things and pull this up for you a little bit. Oops, that did not do what I wanted. So I wanted to just show you a few of those resources that I talked about. So this is our accessibility and supports guide for national special testing. If you go to the ACT website and just search for accessibility and supports guide, it will show up there, or when you get the PDF of this presentation, it is linked to the PDF. And here on the left, you can see, you can jump to things. So here we talk about educational teams, testing with the supports, just general, and the different types of supports that are available, who determines whether or not they're allowable. And here we also talk about this consent to release information to ACT, which is something that you keep at the school, but since you're providing ACT with personally identifiable information that generally is confidential, you need to have something on hand that says, the parent says, yes, you can provide that to ACT. And then requests for accommodations on the ACT are done through our TAA system. And so there's a link here in the Accessibility Supports Guide to our success@act.org, where you set up your initial account and then you request TAA access. We give it to you and you use a button there to get into TAA. Again, understanding. So here, when we talk about the different systems, it's there. Under defining, we have a table that talks about this is it, what is it, who it's for is our recommendations on who it's for. Other people may use it, but this is generally speaking who this support might be appropriate for. And then any notes that we needed to add to help explain those better. And then applying accessibility supports is another table that tells you whether it's an accommodation and what tests it can be used on. So the answer eliminator is actually a U, which is a universal support, which means it can be used by any student. And all that is explained, bilingual dictionary, it's EL because your English learners are going to be using that. So that's what this test tells you. And this test also, or this chart also tells you whether it's available at a national testing center or whether or not that would put the student into our special testing program, which generally speaking happens at the school. Now, a school does not have to provide special testing, but you need to let us know that you're not going to. But as I said, the special testing program is usually done at the school during a 2-week window. If your school is not going to, you let us know and we can help the student find a different location. Then again, we talk about that here in the book. That's why I said this is kind of your one-stop shop now. Test administration details. We talk about facilities here, timing guidelines, testing more than one testing with scribes and interpreters. So a lot of this used to be in the administration manual. It is now in this accessibility supports guide. So it really talks about how this would be administered on the ACT test. So you can dig into more details about that. We talk about the screen reader software, that pre-recorded audio, and what happens for examinees who decline using their authorization. And so what is it that you should do if come test day they say, I don't want it? And then our contact information if you need more information for us. So that's the one, and as I said, that to me is the most important one because it provides so much information. The other place you can find our resources available to educators, I'm going to scroll up to the top, sorry about that, is on our webpage. And so it talks about the steps and different things, but I'm going to keep the windows for special testing. It has a link to the registration, but down here under forms and resources, you have your consent to release. We have an infographic that talks about national versus special. We have different resources, again, that are available, and then the link to that guide that I just showed you. So that ends the information that I have for you today. I hope that I was able to answer and cover the topics that you needed. I'm going to go ahead and end my presentation for you. And again, as I said, thank you so much for letting me join you and cover these things.
Thank you so much. We do have some questions for you if you can take a couple or a few.
Okay, I will do my best to answer them.
Great. So this is, first question is from a local psychologist. He says, ACT seems to now place greater emphasis on an evaluator assessing a student's functioning, yet there are limited numbers of measures that directly assess function level and severity level of certain conditions. For example, ADHD, a mood disorder, anxiety, etc. So are there any suggestions from ACT for practitioners to give them guidance on their selection or on the evaluation process, on their test selection?
Right. So when we're talking about their functioning and the impairment, how is it affecting their life? Many evaluators will do a family interview, and I don't know exactly 100% what those look like, but being able to provide, you know, rather than just they have a long history of it, if we can kind of have, you know, what do you mean by a long history? What has, you know, what we're looking for is more of kind of the impact rather than just they have a long history. And I'm not 100% sure what that would look like. I'm not a psychologist, to be honest. So I'm not sure if there are any tools out there, but we are looking at that impact, you know, how is it impacting them in different areas? So
yes,
as I said, I don't know of any specific tools, but yeah.
I have another question for you, and that is, this is from a school counselor who said, are psychiatric diagnoses still required? Do they still require a full psychoeducational testing, or will documentation from a medical doctor or psychiatrist for anxiety, OCD, panic, etc., will that do?
As long as it is showing that impact, that's really part of it. Part of what we're looking for is how is the diagnosis impacting the student. So as long as it's a qualified professional, that's the right person to provide that diagnosis, then we can say, okay, we understand the diagnosis, and then we need to look for that level of, does the diagnosis raise to the level of a disability under the ADA? And so that's where we're looking at that impact of the diagnosis.
Got it. Thank you. That's helpful.
I have questions too. I have a question. I noticed that you said something about highlighters. I requested, now this has been several years back, but I requested the use of different colored pens for the student to write in the book, and it's been denied. Is that appropriate now? I mean, is that acceptable now?
You can request it. Just in your request, make sure that you're saying it's in the test book. It was probably denied because you would not be allowed to use those on an answer document.
No.
Right. And honestly, I've been at ACT for about 5 years now, and we have, some of these have been around a long time, but how they're interpreted and how they're used adjusts. That's the best way to say it. So yes, if you wanted to say, if you were to request it today and let us know that they need to mark it in the test booklet, then it would most likely be approved.
Okay, because one of the things that I found is that some of the stuff has been denied because it wasn't listed in their accommodation plan. Well, I mean, I would not use different colored pens on a
right.
Teacher sitting in the classroom, the kids just doing that. It's kind of like being able to use a note card or a scratch paper to hide answers to questions, so they only see them one at a time, or they come up with the answer and then go back and look for the one that they want. But those are kinds of things that have been denied because that wasn't specified specifically in their accommodation plan. Because you don't always think
and I understand, and we're trying to be things that are less impactful on the test. I mean, obviously things like extra time and things like that are more impactful on the test. When they need to bring something into the testing environment, like the note cards or things like that, we are trying to be less rigorous about whether or not that's specifically on the plan. Does that kind of make sense? It's kind of an adjustment in how we're reviewing things. Yeah.
Because it's been denied so often, because it's like common sense kind of stuff that a teacher would just kind of normally go, yeah, you can, cover up your answer, use paper, and it's not specifically on the plan, so then it gets denied. So I'm glad to know that. I have another question. One of the medical devices, you had talked about medical devices with the stop clock breaks. If they're getting stop clock breaks for a medical device or for whatever reason, they have to test alone, or do they not?
They do have to test alone because the timing doesn't stop for everyone in the room. It only stops for that student. So we do have them test alone.
The other thing I've noticed is that when you go in, I'm sorry, I got a list of questions.
No, that's okay.
When you go in and you mark, this student has an IEP, this student has a formalized plan, blah, blah, blah. If a student is checked with an IEP, they're pretty much automatically approved. They're not asking for all of as much stuff. We're in a Catholic schools, we don't use IEPs, we use a formalized plan, but mine are requiring, like within it has to be within a certain time frame. What is it, Judy? Yeah, it has to be within a year where IEPs won't. So that was, I was confused about why, there was that discrepancy with those of us that are in private schools.
That has to do with the policy update, and I need to pull that up. Again, the policy update is on our website. Let me see if I can pull it up for you. And let me pull it over here. Sorry. And let me share my screen again, possibly. So here we go. So when the policy update happened, we put out a press release that did explain that. So we will approve allowable accommodations that are on the plan if it's included on their IEP or 504 plan. And part of that is that the IDEA in Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act contains some very rigorous requirements that public schools must follow in determining eligibility, disability, and what accommodations the student needs to access their education. So
we had like, I'm not allowed to use the term 504 plan. I don't have IEPs. So it almost seems like our students are at a disadvantage.
It's it's under the.
Can I ask a follow-up question? I have a student, for example, that transferred to a private school from a public school. She had a 504 in her public school setting, but we, again, in private schools cannot use that terminology. And her ACT accommodations have not been approved with her plan at my school, even though they were like automatically approved when she was at a public school. And it's that kind of discrepancy that's really frustrating.
Thank you. I'm glad I'm
And oftentimes the accommodations are exactly the same.
Yes, they're exactly the same.
Did you send the IEP along with them?
Yeah, you can. You can send the IEP.
But it's
Yes.
It doesn't matter.
Yeah, you can still do it.
Just history of diagnosis.
I think, I hope, yeah.
Okay, let's let Myra jump back in. What do you think?
Okay, so if they had an IEP at a public school, and I'm going to say a fairly recent IEP, and then they transferred to the private school, send that in, and then we're going to look at the plan you've put in place at your school with the IEP, and if the accommodations are the same, that will have us go, okay, these are accommodations the student has been using. Same thing with a 504. And when I say fairly recent, I've had people send in IEPs from 3rd or 4th grade, and the student is now in high school. And that's where I'm like going, we're less likely to take that than something that's more fairly recent. Because we're looking at current impact, history of use. And so what is it that is currently being used, and have they been using it? So that's the difference, and it has to do with, you know, the federal laws of IDEA and Section 504 and the requirements of those two federal laws around accommodations. And as you say, private schools don't follow those two laws necessarily, because as you say, you can't use an IEP or a 504. You can't use those words because you're following the ADA, which is different.
Thank you. We've got a couple more questions from you, Dr. White.
Okay.
So if a child has an acquired ADHD, so it would have been onset after age 12, should we file that under a medical, as a request under a medical issue, or how is that going to be handled? And
so the acquired ADHD, as long as we can see in the diagnosis, you know, why wasn't it, you know, why wasn't it diagnosed early? Or, you know, we need to see the evidence of, you know, maybe it wasn't diagnosed before, but they saw signs early on, those types of things. is what helps us. And whether it's done as a psychological or a medical really isn't what we're looking for the diagnosis. With ADHD, we're looking at why wasn't it diagnosed before this year? You know, you've made it to high school. What has made a difference on why we're diagnosing it now?
Well, maybe they were, I mean, ADHD can be diagnosed in adults as well. My concern with that is maybe I've got an extremely bright kid that's been able to keep up and has done fine. Now we have level classes. He's taken AP and honors level classes. And all of a sudden that ADHD is rearing its ugly head and is impacting his performance where it wasn't impacting it before. And he may just be a sophomore or junior in high school and figuring it out.
So he has ADHD because the rigor of his classes has increased.
What I'm saying is that ADHD was not having a negative impact on his performance until he was put in higher level classes. A bright kid, he was functioning just fine in regular level classes, and he wasn't challenged. Now that he's in classes that are actually probably on the appropriate level for him, the ADHD is having a negative impact.
Well, and we need to think of it as a substantial limitation, not just in learning. So if he has ADHD, how has this impacted other areas of his life besides just the rigor of his classes?
So I could put down that he loses his car keys twice a week.
Right. He loses his car keys twice a week. You know, at home, he can't stay organized. He needs to be reminded multiple times to do things. So,
Okay, so is that
that's where
acceptable?
Yeah, that's what she's saying.
Is that acceptable documentation from my position? Can I document that and send in a notice or a letter documenting what I see as impact? Or would they be required to go get that documentation from a psychologist?
Or a letter from their.
Right, can that come from the school or
or-
from a medical professional?
It can be something from a parent that explains how this has impacted the student at home, and this is what we've been seeing at home, but it didn't really impact his learning until, this. So parents telling the story of what they've seen with their child at home is great documentation to help us see that history, even though they may not see it from a psychologist.
Tony?
This may be similar. I've had two upperclassmen who have just been diagnosed with significant visual impairment diagnoses over the summer. So we're working hard with such recent and significant vision loss to secure accommodations through ACT. In both cases, I've received the feedback saying your appeal it's not approved, and here's what more you need. And your last answer may have answered my question, because this is so sudden, especially for a senior. And
Right.
to all this information, it would be cost prohibitive. We already have what I would think would be sufficient. So I guess going back to your answer previously, I've tried school letterhead that I've written about the impacts. I can go to the parents and ask that too, or what else with a recent?
Oh yeah, go ahead and ask the parents so they can say this is how it's impacting the student. And this was just recently. I would reemphasize that this just happened over the summer. Maybe it's.
This may be a trivial question, but time is of the essence with both of those cases. I've already appealed once and am prepared to appeal twice, but does there get to a point where that's just not an efficient or respectful use of time?
This is a hard one. I cannot say that you can't appeal. So prefacing that with that, if generally,
Answer, because the
yeah.
reason why I'm respectful, I'm representing my school, and I don't want to be that guy that calls, over appeals over
Right.
and over again. I want to be respectful to your office.
and I understand that. Especially when it's a recent diagnosis, we're really trying to understand. I mean, that's what you're trying to hear from us, is we're trying to understand how he made it to his senior year. How did he make it to his senior year without nobody knowing that he had a vision loss? That's kind of why the parent letter helps us a little bit to understand the history. You can call the ACT help desk and ask to get an analyst contact. And that's where you can ask to have one of my analysts call you and talk about it, that you're going, you know, I've appealed, I don't understand what else you need, this, you know, sort of give us a little background. We'll go in, check all the documentation again. It'll be, you know, we have multiple analysts look at things, especially, we have one look at it on the first, and then we'll have somebody different look at it on the second. And, you know, if you're going, I have submitted everything you've asked for and I don't understand what else you need, you can have us give you a call. And then we can go through and sort of say, this is what we're seeing, this is what we're not seeing. Can you provide us more information on it? We're not going to make a decision change on a phone call, but we can say, hey, you know, this information you provided, can you write that down and send it in to us?
Thank you, Marvin. That's very helpful.
Yeah. Yeah, but you can ask very specifically to talk to an analyst, and they may give you a little pushback, and you can just say, I really need to talk to someone so I can understand what they need. And then they will put it through.
One last question for you.
So I've had
Yep.
students that are high achieving students that have accommodation plans with us, that have all the appropriate documentation. And they sometimes express a reservation about applying for extended time accommodations in fear that this will show on their records and will be a detrimental criteria.
It does not appear anywhere.
And so
Right. Right. There is nothing in their score reports. There is nothing that is reported to the schools that indicates in any way that they have applied for accommodations or used accommodations. That is not indicated anywhere. Now, if they go to a college and they want those accommodations, that would be the student providing the school that information, but ACT does not provide that any information in any way.
Okay, thank you very much.
Sure.
Myra, thank you so much. We really appreciate your time
Thank you.
and walking us through these current processes that you have. We appreciate your time and have a good afternoon.
Great. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Bye-bye.
Bye.